The evening air in Walford carried a strange kind of tension, the kind that lingered quietly beneath laughter, beneath music, beneath the illusion of celebration. What should have been a perfect wedding night for Vicky Fowler and Ross Marshall instead felt like the beginning of something far more fragile, something already threatening to fracture before it had even fully begun. The marquee lights glowed warmly, casting soft reflections across glasses of Prosecco and polished shoes, while voices overlapped in cheerful chaos. Yet beneath that surface, something had already shifted. The night had taken a breath, and without anyone realizing it, everything had already started to change. Meanwhile, across the gathering, Kathy Beale laughed a little too loudly, her words slurring just enough to draw attention. One drink had turned into several, and the careful composure she usually carried had slipped into something looser, something unpredictable. Nearby, Cindy Beale watched with narrowed eyes, her expression sharpened by old resentments that never truly faded. It hashtag didn't take long for the tension between them to ignite. A passing remark, hashtag careless but loaded, was enough to bring years of buried hostility to the surface. Their voices cut through the music, sharp and unmistakable, drawing glances from guests who pretended not to listen while absorbing every word. From a distance, Ian Beale noticed immediately. There was a familiar sinking feeling in his chest, one he had learned never to ignore. He moved quickly, stepping in before things escalated further, his instincts driven not just by embarrassment, but by something deeper, a need to contain chaos before it spread. He placed a steady hand on his mother's arm, his voice low but firm, urging her to leave before the situation worsened. Kathy resisted at first, brushing him off with drunken defiance, but the exhaustion beneath her bravado began to show. Eventually, she relented, leaning more heavily on him than she intended. To Ian, it felt like the right decision. Removing her from the situation meant restoring order, meant preventing another public spectacle that would ripple through the square by morning. It was a simple act of responsibility, one he believed would quietly fix everything. But what Ian didn't know, what no one in that moment could have known, was that the night had already moved beyond simple fixes. As he guided Kathy away from the celebration hashtag, the music continued behind them, laughter icing again, as if nothing had happened. The world they stepped out of remained intact, unchanged in appearance, untouched by the invisible thread of consequence already tightening around them. At the same time, inside the marquee, the absence of Kathy barely registered. Conversations resumed, glasses were refilled, and the fragile illusion of normalcy stitched itself back together with surprising ease. Yet the cracks remained, unseen but growing. Not far from the dance floor, Chelsea Fox stood with a drink in hand, her attention drifting between the music and the people around her. There was a spark in her expression, something playful, something alive in the moment. Nearby, Mark Fowler caught her eye, and the subtle exchange between them carried the kind of energy that didn't need words to be understood. Their conversation started lightly, almost casually, but there was an undercurrent that neither of them fully acknowledged. It was the kind of connection that built quietly, fed by glances and half-smiles, by the sense that something hashtagging might happen if the moment allowed it. However, momenti hashtags like that rarely exist in isolation. Not in Walford. Not on a night like this. Before anything could deepen, tension erupted nearby. Zach Hudson, already carrying the weight of unresolved feelings, found himself drawn into an argument with Mark. The subject shifted quickly, but at its core lay something far more complicated, something tied to Vicky Fowler and everything that had happened leading up to this night. The words grew sharper, louder, fueled by frustration that had been building long before the wedding began. Guests to once again, the fragile piece of the evening breaking for the second time, each disruption adding another layer to the sense that something was unraveling. It was Lauren Branning who stepped in, her voice cutting through the argument with a calm authority that demanded attention. She positioned herself between them, diffusing the confrontation before it could escalate further, though the tension remained, lingering in #he air like static. Outside, away from the noise and the eyes of others, Zach followed Chelsea. The shift in atmosphere was immediate #E, the distance from the party creating a space where things felt more exposed, more honest. The earlier tension melted into something quieter, something charged in a different way. They stood close, closer than either of them initially intended. The conversation softened, slowed, slipping into something more personal, more dangerous. There was a moment #NT, brief but unmistakable, where everything seemed to pause. Chelsea felt it. Zach felt it. The space between them narrowed, the possibility of a kiss hovering just at the edge of reality. It wasn't planned, wasn't calculated. It was the kind of moment that simply happened, born out of emotion rather than logic. And then it was G1. Int erupted before it could fully exist. The moment collapsed under the weight of circumstance. A voice from inside, a reminder of the world they had stepped away from, pulled him back, before they could cross a line neither of them was ready to face. Chelsea exhaled slowly, the tension still present but now tangled with something else, uncertainty, perhaps, or the faintest trace of regret. Without saying much more, she turned and headed back toward the marquee, leaving the moment behind her. But moments like that #ont disappear. They linger. #EY wait. Inside, the celebration continued, but something had shifted again. Something subtle, something no one could quite name, yet everyone could feel if they paid attention. At that very moment, far from the laughter and music, Denise Fox sat in a hospital room, the sterile silence pressing in around her. The contrast between her world and the wedding could not have been more stark. The doctor's words echoed in her mind, repeating themselves with a clarity that felt almost cruel. There was no misunderstanding, no room for hope to reshape the meaning. The diagnosis was real. It was serious. And it was happening to her. Denise stared ahead, her thug HTS struggling to catch up with reality. The life she knew, the stability she had built, suddenly felt fragile, as if it could collapse under the weight of a single truth. #End sir. The word settled heavily, refusing to be ignored, refusing to soften. It changed everything in an instant, rewriting the future she had imagined without asking for permission. Her first instinct wasn't fear for herself. It was something else entirely. It was her family. Chelsea. The thought of her daughter cut through the shock, ground in Denise in a way nothing else could. No matter what was happening to her, no matter what she had just been told, Chelsea came first. She always had. Even so, the weight of the diagnosis pressed down on her, demanding to be acknowledged. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to process what came next, what this meant, how she was supposed to move forward from this moment. Meanwhile, back at the wedding, Orlando Truman scanned the sea route, her concern growing with each passing minute. Denise was nowhere to be seen, and the longer she was gone, the more something didn't feel right. Yolanda knew Denise well enough to sense when something was off. This wasn't just a simple delay, or a change of plans. There was something deeper, something wrong. Not long after, Denise returned, not to the wedding, but to Fox and Hare, seeking space, distance, anything that might help her breathe again. The world felt too loud, too overwhelming, and she needed a moment where everything could be still. But even there, she couldn't escape what she had learned. The truth followed her, settled beside her, refused to let her pretend that everything was fine. When Yolanda finally found her, the relief was immediate, but it was quickly replaced by concern as she took in Denise's expression. Something had changed. Something profound. #D. At first, Denise tried to hold it together. She tried to maintain the calm #posure she had always relied on, the strength that had carried her through so much before. But this was different. This wasn't something he could manage alone. The words came slowly at first, hesitant, as if speaking them aloud would make them more real. But once they start #D, the why didn't stop. The truth poured out, raw and unfiltered, each sentence carrying the weight of what she had just been told. Yolanda listened, her heart breaking with every word. The gravity of the situation settled over them both #TH, turning the small space into something heavy, something fragile. Denise's voice faltered as she reached the end, the reality of it all finally catching up with her. For a moment, neither of them spoke #E. There was nothing to say that could make it better, nothing that could undo what had already been set in motion. Outside, the night continued. The wedding carried on. Lives moved forward, unaware of how drastically things were beginning to change. But within that quiet space, everything had already shifted. And this was only the beginning. The night did not pause to allow anyone time to process what had already begun. It moved forward with a quiet, relentless force, threading separate moments together into something far more devastating than any single event could be on its own. Inside the Beale house, Ian Beale helped Kathy Beale settle onto the sofa, the remnants of the wedding still clinging faintly to their clothes, to their voices, to the illusion that the evening had been nothing more than a celebration. Kathy, still flushed from alcohol, looked at her son with softened eyes, the sharpness from earlier replaced by something warmer, more reflective. There was a tenderness in her expression that didn't appear often, a vulnerability that surfaced only when her guard had been lowered. She reached for his hand, holding it with surprising firmness. Her voice, though slightly unsteady, carried an unmistakable sincerity. She told him how proud she was. Proud of the man he had become. Proud of the why he had built something for himself despite everything life had thrown at him. The words landed exactly where Ian had always needed him to. For a brief moment, the noise of Walford faded away. The arguments, the tensions, the endless complications that defined his life seemed to recede into the background. All that remained was this quiet exchange, this rare moment of approval from the person whose opinion had always mattered most. And then she mentioned it. #Kuansila Beale. The title sat heavily in the room, filled with meaning, with validation. Kathy smiled as she said it, as if it confirmed something she had always believed about her son, that he was capable of more, that he deserved recognition, that he had finally achieved something that could not be taken away. Ian absorbed every word, allowing himself to feel it fully. Pride, relief, satisfaction, it all came at once, building into something almost overwhelming. For once, things seemed to be aligning in his favor. For once, the narrative of his life didn't feel like constant damage control. But outside, the night had already begun rewriting that narrative. A knock at the door cut through the moment with a sharp, final sound. At first, Ian barely registered it. He was still caught in the warmth of his mother's words, still holding on to the fragile sense of accomplishment that had settled over him. But the knock came again, more insistent this time, pulling him back into reality. There was hashtag something about it. Something urgent. Something WR hashtag on. He stood, hesitating for a fraction of a second before moving toward the door. Kathy watched him, her expression shifting slightly, as if some instinct deep within her recognized the change in atmosphere before it fully revealed itself. When Ian opened the D hashtag or, everything changed. The words spoken on the other side were not loud. THEY didn't need to be. Their weight was enough to fracture everything in an instant. His hashtag expression froze. For a second, it was as if he hadn't understood. As if his mind had rejected the meaning outright, refusing to process something so completely out of place with the moment that had come just before. Then the hashtag settled in. The color drained from his face, the pride that had filled him only moments earlier collapsing into something hollow, something unrecognizable. His grip on the doorframe tightened, as though it were the only thing holding him upright. Behind him, Kathy called out, her voice uncertain now, sensing the shift she could not yet see. But Ian didn't respond. He couldn't hashtag T. The words had already taken hold, reshaping everything, pulling the ground out from beneath him. As more details followed, each hashtag any heavier than the last, the full scale of what had happened began to emerge. And with it came a realization that struck deeper than anything else. The hashtag S wasn't something that could be fixed. This wasn't a situation he could manage, control, or talk his way out of. This hashtag was something that would stay. His life, the structure he had built piece by piece, was no longer stable. It had shifted, cracked open in a way that could not be undone. And in that moment, standing in his own doorway, Ian understood something with terrifying clarity. He was about to lose Eve hashtag Rithying. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Denise Fox struggled to reconcile the reality of her diagnosis with the demands of the world waiting for her outside those walls. The doctor's voice still echoed in her mind, calm and clinical, outlining next steps as if THEY were routine. As if this was something that could be approached logically, methodically, without emotion. But Denise was not thinking about treatment plans or timelines. She hashtag S thinking about how to tell the people she loved. Or whether she should tell them at all. The idea of bringing that kind of fear into their lives, of forcing them to carry the weight she had just been handed, felt almost unbearable. She had always been the one who held things together, the one who absorbed pressure so others wouldn't have to. Now, for the first time in a LON hashtag G time, she wasn't sure hashtag she could do that. When the call came through, urgent, unexpected, it cut through her thoughts with immediate force. The voice on the other end hashtag as strained, filled with a kind of panic that left no room for misunderstanding. Something had happened. Something serious. Chelsea. The name alone was enough to override everything else. The diagnosis, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it was pushed aside in an instant. Denise didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. Whatever it was, her daughter hashtag needed her. And that hashtag SEN hashtag off. She moved quickly, leaving the hospital behind without looking back, her focus narrowing to a single point. The night, already fractured, began to collapse further as its separate three ads tightened around one another. Back at the wedding, the atmosphere had shifted again, though most people couldn't yet explain why. There was a subtle unease now, a sense that something wasn't quite right, even if no one had the full picture. Chelsea Fox had returned inside earlier, but the lightness she had seen arid before was gone. Something about the interrupted moment with Zach Hudson lingered, leaving her distracted, unsettled in a way she couldn't easily shake. Around her, the celebration continued, but it felt distant now, disconnected from whatever was building beneath the surface. Conversations blurred together, laughter sounding slightly too forced, as if everyone were playing their part, without fully believing in it anymore. At the same time, elsewhere in Walford, tensions that had nothing to do with the wedding were reaching their own breaking point. In George's home, Gina Knight paced back and forth, her frustration spilling over into sharp, restless energy. The presence of Eddie Knight in their lives had already created enough strain, but what she had learned, what she had been told, pushed things into something far more personal. Her anger wasn't just about inconvenience or disruption. It was about betrayal. About the realization the man who should have represented stability, authority, family, was instead the source of something far darker. When she finally confronted George Knight, the words came out with a force she could #and contain. She told him everything, every detail, every comment that had left her shaken, every piece of truth she could no longer hold inside. George listened, at first in sigh #lens, his expressy on tightening with each passing second. There was disbelief there, but it didn't last long. Because deep down, part of him had always #ys known. The image he had tried to maintain, the idea that things could be different, that the past didn't have to define the present, began to crumble under the weight of what Gina was saying. And when the full truth settled in, the shift in him was immediate. The restraint he had been holding on to snapped. Meanwhile, unaware of how many lives were beginning to fracture at once, Max Branning stood at the center of the wedding reception, his attention fixed entirely on Cindy Beale. There was a frustration in him, one that had been building quietly over time. He was tired of not being taken seriously, tired of feeling like his place in her life was something temporary, so undefined. The noise of the room faded as he made his decision. Without warning, he moved toward the microphone, drawing attention with a confidence that bordered on reckless. Conversations quieted, curiosity pulling eyes toward him as he began to speak. His words were direct, unfiltered, driven by emotion rather than strategy. He spoke about love, about certainty, about the kind of connection that didn't need justification. And then, before anyone could fully process what was happening, he asked the question. He asked Cindy to marry him. The room #O's. For a moment, it was as if time itself had paused, waiting for our response #E. Cindy stood there, caught between expectation and shock, her usual composure slipping just enough to reveal how unprepared she was for this. Around them, reactions rippled outward, surprise, confusion, disbelief. But the answer, whatever it would be, had yet to come. And as that question hung in the air, unanswered, the night continued its slow, inevitable descent into something no one would forget. The night no longer carried the rhythm of celebration, but instead unfolded with a quiet inevitability, as though every event had already been set in motion long before anyone realized the significance of what was happening. What had begun as a wedding filled with laughter and expectation, was now shifting into something heavier, something layered with consequences that could not yet be fully seen, but were already being deeply felt across Walford. Inside the Marquee, the moment created by Max Branning's sudden proposal did not resolve in the way such moments were meant to. Instead of joy or clarity, it left behind a suspended tension that lingered uneasily among the guests, spreading in subtle waves that unsettled the atmosphere. All attention remained fixed on Cindy Beale, yet her usual composure #med to falter under the unexpected weight of what had just been asked of her. For once, She was not the one controlling the situation, not the one steering events toward a calculated outcome, and that loss of control created a visible shift in her expression. The silence that followed was not peaceful, but strained, filled with unspoken reactions and unformed judgments. Around her, the guests began to exchange glances, their curiosity mixing with discomfort, as if they were all aware that this was not simply a romantic gesture, but something far more complicated, something that carried implications none of them could yet define. However, before any answer could be given, before the moment could settle into something concrete, the fragile balance of the evening shifted once again, pulled apart by events unfolding so here that were far more urgent and far more devastating. Meanwhile, Denise Fox moved through the night with a sense of urgency that overrode every other thought in her mind. The hospital, the diagnosis, the reality of her illness, all of it had been pushed aside, not because it mattered less, but because something else had taken priority in a way that was instinctive and absolute. Her focus had narrowed entirely to her daughter. By the time she reached Chelsea Fox, the emotional shift was immediate and overwhelming, as the situation she encountered made it clear that whatever had happened was not minor, not something that could be dismissed or delayed. Chelsea no longer carried the energy she had shown earlier at the wedding. Instead, there was a visible fracture in her composure, a sign that something had already gone terribly wrong. The details emerged slowly and without structure, arriving in fragments that were different #ICult to assemble into a complete understanding, yet the urgency of the situation did not depend on clarity. Denise did not wait for a full explanation, nor did she allow herself the time to process the implications. Her response was immediate, driven by the same protective instinct that had defined her role as a mother for years. In that moment, her own fear became irrelevant. The diagnosis she had just received, the uncertainty of her future, the weight of what she would soon have to face, none of it held the same importance as the need to be present for Chelsea. The decision was not conscious, but it was absolute, reflecting a pattern that had always defined Denise's choices when it came to her family #lie. At the same time, the consequences of another thread of the night continued to unfold inside the Beale home, where Ian Beale remained caught in the aftermath of he news that had been delivered to him. The initial shock had begun to give way to something more complex and far more difficult to endure, as understanding slowly replaced disbelief. Each detail, once processed, added another layer to the reality he was being forced to accept, reshaping his perception of everything he had believed to be stable. He found himself replaying the moment repeatedly, as if revisiting it might alter its meaning #ing, yet each attempt only reinforced the same conclusion. There was no alternative explanation, no possibility of misinterpretation. What he had been told was final, and the implications extended far beyond a single event. Behind him, Kathy Beale observed the change in her son with growing concern, sensing the shift without yet fully understanding its cause. The earlier warmth that had filled the room had disappeared entirely, replaced by a tension that was difficult to ignore. Her attempts to reach him were met with silence, not out of indifference, but because Ian had not yet found a way to articulate what he now understood. The act of speaking it aloud would transform the situation from something internal into something irreversible, and in that moment, he was not ready to take that step. The realization that followed settled deeply within him, bringing with it a sense of inevitability that was far more frightening than the initial shock. This was not a problem that could be managed or resolved through effort or negotiation. It was a turning point, one that would alter the direction of his life in ways he could not yet fully anticipate, but already knew would be permanent. As these events unfolded in parallel, the wedding, once intended as a moment of unity and celebration, continued to unravel, its significance shifting as the night progressed. The unresolved proposal, the subtle tensions among guests, and the absence of key figures all contributed to an atmosphere that no longer resembled the beginning of something new, but rather the quiet collapse of multiple narratives at once. At the same time, in another part of Walford, the long-standing tension between George Knight and Eddie Knight reached a critical point #NT, where past grievances and present conflicts converged into a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. George approached the situation with a sense of determination that had been building over time, driven by the understanding that certain boundaries had already been crossed too many times to be ignored again. His decision, once made, carried a finality that left no room for compromise, reflecting not only his anger, but also his need to protect those around him from further harm. However, the response he received did not follow the expected pattern. Instead of resistance or denial, Edidi introduced a new element into the situation, one that shifted the balance of power entirely. The revelation he delivered was not simply a defensive reaction, but a calculated act that exposed a hidden connection, one involving Nicola Mitchell and circumstances that had previously remained #concealed. This disclosure altered the context of everything George believed he understood, forcing him to confront a reality that extended beyond his immediate conflict with his father. The situation was no longer contained within the boundaries of family tension, but had expanded into something more complex, involving manipulation and secrecy that reached further than he had anticipated. The emotional impact of this realization was immediate and destabilizing. The control #Orge had maintained until that point began to erode, replaced by a surge of anger that was no longer guided by restraint or careful judgment. What followed was not a measured response, but an impulsive decision, one shaped by emotion rather than reason. And in that moment, the Knight Seros said an #invisible threshold. Because George acted. The consequences of that action were not yet visible, but were already set in motion, adding another irreversible layer to a Knight that had already changed too many lives at once. Back at the wedding, the celebration continued in form, but not in substance #E. The music played, the lights remained bright, and conversations resumed, yet beneath it lay a growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted. Without fully understanding why, those present could feel that the #it would not end the way it was meant to. And more importantly, that whatever had begun could not be undone. The #Night had already crossed a point where it could no longer return to what it had been. Every event, every decision, every high deed in truth was now moving forward with a quiet inevitability, weaving together into something far more destructive than any present could yet fully comprehend. Back at the wedding, the atmosphere continued to function on the surface, with music still playing and guests attempting to recover a sense of normalcy. Yet beneath that effort, there was a growing awareness that something had shifted in a way that could not be repaired simply by ignoring it. Conversations carried a different tone now, more cautious, more fragmented, as if everyone were instinctively adjusting to a reality they did not yet understand. At the center of that uneasy space, Cindy Beale remained suspended in the aftermath of Max Branning's proposal. The question he had asked still lingered in the air, unanswered yet impossible to dismiss, creating a tension that extended far beyond the two of them. Cindy's silence was not hesitation alone, but calculation, as her mind moved through the implications of what accepting, or rejecting, such a public declaration would mean. Around her, the attention of the room had begun to fracture, with some guests returning to their conversations while others remained quietly observant, aware that whatever decision she made would carry consequences that extended well beyond the moment itself. Max, standing opposite her, held his ground with a determination that bordered on desperation. His decision had not been impulsive in the simplest sense, but it had been driven by a need to force clarity into a situation that had long remained undefined. For him, this was not merely a romantic gesture, but a demand for certainty, for recognition, for a place that could no longer be ignored or #dismissed. Yet even as that moment stretched on, its importance was already being overshadowed by events unfolding elsewhere, events that carried a far greater weight and urgency. Meanwhile, Denise Fox found herself fully immersed in the crisis surrounding Chelsea Fox, her focus sharpened by the immediate need to respond rather than reflect. The reality of her diagnosis remained present, but it had been pushed to the background, not out of denial, but because the situation before her demanded everything she had to give. Chelsea's condition, both emotional and situational, made it clear that something serious had occurred, something that required not only support, but decisive action. Denise moved through the moment with a clarity that came from years of experience, prioritizing what needed to be done without allowing herself to be overwhelmed by what she felt. However, the strain of holding those two realities simultaneously, the crisis affecting her daughter and the illness she had yet to fully confront, began to show in subtle ways. There was a tension in her movements, a slight hesitation beneath her decisiveness, as if part of her was already aware that she could not continue to ignore her own situation indefinitely. It was in the midst of this #hat another call came, this time from the hospital, carrying with it a tone that left little room for delay. The message was clear: she needed #O return, and she needed to do so immediately. The weight of that demand created a moment of conflict within her, one that forced her to confront the reality she had been avoiding. For the first time since leaving the hospital, Denise was faced with the necessity of choosing between her role as a mother in the present crisis, and her responsibility to herself in the face of something life-threatening. Even so, the decision she made followed the same pattern that had defined her actions from the beginning of the night. Chelsea came first. Only after ensuring that her daughter was no longer alone in that moment did Den #eyes allow herself to consider what the call truly meant, what its senior led about the urgency of her condition and the limited time she might have to act. Not long after, the emotional burden she had been carrying reached a point where it could no longer remain hidden. The secrecy that had seemed necessary earlier now felt unsustainable, particularly as the night continued to escalate around her. When he finally spoke to Jack Branning, the words did not come easily, but they came with a quiet inevitability that mirrored the rest of the night's unfolding events. Jack's reaction was immediate and profound, shaped not only by the shock of the diagnosis itself but by the realization that Denise had been carrying this knowledge alone, even as everything else had been falling apart around them. The conversation between them did not resolve the situation, but it changed its nature, transforming it from a private burden into a shared reality. In doing so, it added another layer to the emotional weight of the night, reinforcing the sense that no one would leave it unchanged. At the same time, the consequences of the confrontation between George K. Knight and Eddie Knight continued to develop in a direction that neither could fully control. George's earlier decision, made in a moment of anger and determination, had already set events in motion that could not be undone. The revelation involving Nicola Mitchell had destabilized his understanding of the situation, but it had also intensified his response, pushing him further into a state where emotion outweighed restraint. The aftermath of his actions began to take shape not through immediate resolution, but through the growing awareness that the line he had crossed could not simply be erased. What had been intended as protection had instead created a new set of consequences, ones that would extend far beyond the initial conflict. Back at the wedding, the attempt to restore order continued, but it felt increasingly performative, as though everyone present were aware, on some level, that the NIG-HT had already slipped beyond their control. The light still shone, the music still played, and yet the meaning of the event had shifted entirely. What had once been a celebration of unity had become a silent witness to multiple fractures, each one unfolding in parallel, each one co-contributing to a larger collapse that no one had the perspective to fully see. As the hours passed, the connections between these separate events began to tighten, drawing individuals closer to the consequences of decisions they had made, some knowingly, others without any awareness at all. #L. And as all of this continued to unfold, one truth became increasingly clear, even if it had not yet been spoken aloud. This was not simply a difficult night. It was a turning point. The Kindi tea hat reshaped lives in ways that would only become fully visible in the days to come. By the time the night began to edge toward its final hours, the illusion of celebration had all but dissolved, leaving behind a quiet aftermath that carried far more weight than anything that had come before it. What remained was not a single event, but a convergence of consequences, each one rooted in a different moment, a different choice, yet all unfolding within the same narrow span of time that would come to define everything that followed. Back at the wedding, the final traces of normality persisted only in form, as the remaining guests moved through the motions of what the evening had originally been meant to represent. Conversations continued, though more subdued now, and laughter surfaced occasionally, though it lacked the spontaneity it had carried earlier. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable, as though everyone present sensed that something irreversible had taken place, even if they could not yet fully articulate what it was. At the center of that lingering tension, the unresolved moment between Max Branning and Cindy Beale remained suspended, its significance neither resolved nor forgotten. Cindy's silence had not provided clarity, but instead created a space filled with uncertainty, leaving those around them to speculate quietly about what her eventual decision might mean. Max, for his #art, did not attempt to retract what he had said. His stance remained unchanged, his expression reflecting a determination that suggested he had already committed himself fully to the path he had chosen. Yet even his boldness now felt diminished in the context of everything else that had unfolded, as though the important #CE of his gesture had been overtaken by the scale of the night's broader consequences. Meanwhile, the emotional center of the night had shifted decisively toward Denise Fox, whose internal conflict had reached a point where it could no longer remain contained. The decision to finally reveal her diagnosis to Jack Branning had altered the nature of her burden, transforming it from something carried alone into something shared, yet no less heavy. Jack's reaction continued to resonate, not only through his immediate shock, but through the quiet recalibration that followed, as he began to understand the implications of what Denise was facing. The future, once assumed to be stable despite its challenges, now appeared uncertain in a way that neither of them had anticipated, forcing both to confront a reality that extended far beyond the events of a single night. At the same time, Denise's role as a mother remained unchanged, if not intensified, as the situation involving Chelsea Fox continued to demand her attention. The choice she had made, to prioritize Chelsea despite the urgency of her own condition, had reinforced a pattern that defined her identity, yet it also underscored the growing tension between her responsibilities to others and the need to confront her own vulnerability. Chelsea, still reeling from what had occurred earlier in the evening, remained at the center of a situation that had not yet fully resolved, her own future now uncertain in ways that extended beyond the immediate crisis. The events that had disrupted her world were not isolated, but part of a larger chain of consequences that would continue to unfold, shaping her path in ways she could not yet anticipate. Elsewhere, the repercussions of the confrontation between George Knight and Eddie Knight began to solidify into something more tangible, as the reality of George's actions became impossible to ignore. What had been an impulsive decision, driven by anger and a desire to protect, now stood as a turning point that carried consequences far beyond his original intentions. The revelation involving Nicola Mitchell continued to cast a long shadow over the situation, introducing a layer of complexity that extended beyond personal conflict into something more systemic, more deeply rooted in the #hidden dynamics of Walford itself. George's understanding of the situation had been fundamentally altered, and with that shift came the realization that the boundaries he had attempted to enforce were far more fragile than he had believed. Back at the Beale home, Ian Beale remained in the grip of a realization that had yet to fully settle, its implications continuing to unfold with a slow and deliberate weight. The initial shock had given way to a deeper awareness of what lay ahead, as he began to comprehend the extent to which his life had been altered in a single moment. The earlier sense of pride he had felt, bolstered by Kathy's words and the recognition of his position, now seemed distant, almost irrelevant in the face of what he had learned. The contrast between those two moments, separated by only a short span of time, underscored the unpredictability of the night, highlighting the speed with which circumstances could shift from stability to collapse. Kathy Beale, watching her son struggle to process what had happened, began to grasp the seriousness of the situation, even if she did not yet know all the details. The connection between them, which had briefly felt restored earlier in the evening, now took on a different significance, as she prepared to support him through a challenge she could sense, but not yet fully understand. As all of these threads continued to develop, the night moved steadily toward its conclusion, though the term ending no longer seemed appropriate. What had taken place was not something that could be contained within a single evening, nor resolved with the passing of time. Instead, it represented the beginning of a new phase, one defined by the consequences of choices made both recently and long ago. The significance of what had happened would not be measured solely by the events themselves, but by the way those events would continue to shape the lives of those involved. Relationships would be tested, secrets would surface, and the balance of power within Walford would shift in ways that had not yet become visible. And as the final moments of the night gave way to the uncertainty of what would follow, one truth stood above all others. This had not simply been a night that changed everything. It had been the moment when everything that had been hidden, ignored, or post-pwned began to surface all at once, forcing each person involved to confront a reality they could no longer avoid.